"Ma'am, I wasn't expecting to find you sitting next to a trash can." The room went completely silent. A moment earlier, people had been laughing. My father had been laughing the loudest. My brother's promotion ceremony was supposed to be the biggest day of his life. Military officers, family friends, local officials, and neighbors had gathered in a banquet hall outside Norfolk, Virginia. The atmosphere had been cheerful, proud, celebratory. Then an admiral walked through the door. Instead of heading toward the stage, he stopped in his tracks and stared directly at me. At the woman sitting beside a trash can. The same woman everyone had spent the last 20 minutes humiliating. I remember the expression on my father's face. Confusion. Then concern. Then something else. Fear. But before I tell you what happened that afternoon, I need to explain how we got there. Because nothing about that moment made sense unless you understood my family. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 42 years old at the time. And for most of my life, I had been the disappointment. At least according to my father. I grew up in a small town outside Richmond, Virginia. My father, Richard Carter, believed strongly in hard work discipline and traditional values. There wasn't anything wrong with that. The problem was that he only seemed to see those qualities in my younger brother, Michael. Michael could do no wrong. If Michael got a B in school, Dad praised him. If I got an A, Dad asked why it wasn't an A+. When Michael made varsity football, Dad celebrated for weeks. When I earned a statewide academic scholarship, Dad barely mentioned it. At first, I thought I simply needed to try harder. Then I got older, and I realized the rules were different. Some children grow up trying to earn love. Others grow up learning they never will. I belonged to the second group. My mother did her best to balance things. She loved both of us, but she passed away from cancer when I was 22. After that, whatever restraint existed inside my father seemed to disappear. Michael became his pride. I became his burden. At 18, I enlisted in the Navy, not because I was running away, because I wanted purpose, structure, service. I wanted to build something that belonged to me. Dad's response still echoed in my memory. "Can't make it in college, so you're joining the military." The disappointment in his voice hurt more than I admitted. I spent years proving him wrong. Or maybe proving myself right. Either way, I stopped seeking his approval. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was more complicated. Part of me never stopped wanting my father to look at me the way he looked at Michael. I just got better at hiding it. Over the next 2 decades, my career took me around the world. Deployments, training commands, disaster relief operations, humanitarian missions, leadership positions. The work mattered. The people mattered. The mission mattered. Recognition never mattered much to me. In fact, I rarely talked about my accomplishments. Partly because military culture teaches humility. Partly because I knew my father wouldn't care anyway. Whenever relatives asked what I did, I usually gave vague answers. "I'm in the Navy." That was enough. Most of them assumed I handled paperwork somewhere. I never corrected them. Life became easier that way. Meanwhile, Michael stayed close to home. He joined public service, built connections, married young, had 2 children, and became the center of every family gathering. Dad loved introducing him. "This is my son." The pride practically glowed from him. I learned to smile through it. Years passed. Then Michael received a significant promotion. A ceremony was scheduled near Norfolk. The entire family was invited. When the invitation arrived, I considered declining. Not because I disliked Michael. Despite everything, I loved my brother. The problem was that family gatherings always left me feeling like an outsider. Still, something told me to go. Maybe loyalty. Maybe curiosity. Maybe hope. Hope has a funny way of surviving long after it should be dead. The banquet hall sat beside a marina overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. It was a beautiful spring afternoon. Sunlight reflected off the water. Flags fluttered in the breeze. People chatted happily in the parking lot. Everything looked picture perfect. When I walked inside, nobody noticed me. That wasn't unusual. I signed the guest book and found my assigned table. Or tried to. My name wasn't there. I checked again. Nothing. Eventually, I found a handwritten place card near the catering station. Beside a large gray trash can. A folding chair. Not a banquet chair. Not a seat at a table. A folding chair. I honestly thought it was a mistake. Then I heard my father's voice. "Oh, there she is." People turned. Dad grinned. The grin told me everything. This wasn't an accident. He had planned it. I walked over calmly. "Dad, is this supposed to be my seat?" Several guests looked uncomfortable. My father laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A deliberate one. The kind meant to entertain an audience. Then he said the words that would change everything. "Trash belongs with trash." The room exploded with laughter. Some people laughed because they agreed. Others laughed because they felt pressured. A few looked horrified. Michael chuckled awkwardly. Not because he thought it was funny, because he didn't want to challenge Dad. That hurt more than I expected. For a brief moment I considered leaving, driving away, never speaking to any of them again. But something stopped me. Maybe dignity, maybe stubbornness, maybe 20 years of military training. Instead I pulled out the chair, sat down, folded my hands, and smiled. The laughter gradually faded. Conversation resumed. Music played. Servers carried trays through the room. Life moved on, at least for everyone else. Inside, old wounds had reopened. Not because of the chair, not because of the trash can. Because a 42-year-old woman suddenly felt like a little girl again. The daughter who never measured up. The daughter nobody saw. I stared out the window toward the marina, breathed slowly, and reminded myself of something important. People can only define your worth if you hand them the power to do it. I had learned that lesson years ago. Still, lessons sometimes need repeating. About 20 minutes later, a strange movement caught my attention outside. Several black government SUVs had entered the parking lot. The vehicles parked near the entrance. Security personnel stepped out. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Guests noticed. Whispers spread. Someone important had arrived. Very important. My father straightened his tie. Michael adjusted his jacket. The master of ceremonies hurried toward the entrance. Everyone assumed the visitor had come to honor my brother. Nobody looked at me. Nobody noticed the small smile forming on my face. Because unlike everyone else in that room, I knew exactly who had just arrived. And I knew the day was about to change forever. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not complete silence. More like a ripple moving through the room. Conversation slowed. Laughter faded. People turned toward the entrance one by one. The banquet hall had been loud all afternoon. Glasses clinked. Families chatted. Children wandered between tables. The sound of celebration filled every corner. Then the black SUVs arrived. And everything changed. I remained seated beside the trash can. The same folding chair. The same spot my father had chosen for me. Servers continued moving around me carrying trays of iced tea and appetizers. Every now and then someone glanced my way with sympathy. Most quickly looked away. People rarely know what to do when they witness humiliation. My father, meanwhile, was enjoying himself. He stood near the stage, surrounded by relatives and local officials. His chest practically swelled with pride every time someone congratulated Michael. "Your son has done well, Richard." "Thank you." "He should be proud." "Oh, he is?" Dad loved every second of it. Michael stood nearby, shaking hands and accepting congratulations. To his credit, he looked uncomfortable every time his eyes drifted toward my chair. But uncomfortable wasn't the same as courageous. He never came over, never apologized, never offered me a seat. Sometimes silence becomes its own form of participation. Outside, vehicle doors opened. Several uniformed personnel stepped onto the sidewalk. Guests began whispering. "Who is that?" "Must be somebody important." "I heard an admiral might attend." My father's eyes lit up. An admiral? For him, that was better than Christmas morning. A high-ranking military officer attending Michael's promotion ceremony would become a story he'd tell for years. The master of ceremonies hurried toward the entrance. Several local officials straightened their jackets. Even Michael looked surprised. Apparently, this guest had not been listed on the official program. I took a slow sip of water and watched. The doors opened. A Navy admiral entered the hall. Tall, distinguished, silver hair, rows of ribbons across his dress uniform. His presence commanded immediate attention, not because he demanded it, because he had earned it. People instinctively stepped aside. Conversation stopped altogether. The admiral nodded politely as he entered. The master of ceremonies approached him immediately. So did several officers. Everyone expected him to move toward the stage, toward Michael, toward the guest of honor. Instead, something unexpected happened. The admiral stopped. Completely stopped. His eyes had found me. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. Then he changed direction and started walking straight toward the trash can. Toward me? I heard confusion spreading through the crowd. People turned to follow his path. Their expressions changed as they realized where he was going, or rather, who he was going to. The admiral crossed the room. One table, then another, until he stood directly in front of me. I slowly rose to my feet, not because protocol required it, because respect goes both ways. He looked at the folding chair, then at the trash can, then at me. His expression hardened. Not with anger toward me, with disbelief toward the situation. Then he spoke. "Ma'am, I wasn't expecting to find you sitting next to a trash can." The room froze. Every conversation died instantly. The words echoed through the hall. People exchanged confused looks. My father blinked. Michael looked stunned. Several officers stared openly. The Admiral wasn't merely speaking politely. He was speaking with genuine respect. The kind reserved for someone important. I smiled. "It's fine, Admiral." He glanced at the chair again. "No, ma'am, it isn't." A nervous laugh escaped someone nearby. Nobody joined in. The atmosphere had completely changed. A few minutes earlier, people had been laughing at me. Now they were trying to understand what they had missed. The Admiral turned toward a nearby staff member. "Please bring another chair." Immediately. No hesitation. Within seconds, employees were rushing to rearrange seating. The speed of their response only added to the confusion. Dad finally stepped forward. "Admiral, sir." The Admiral acknowledged him politely. "Mr. Carter." Dad seemed relieved that the Admiral knew his name. He assumed the attention was still connected to Michael. "My son is being recognized today." "Yes," the Admiral replied. "I understand." The response sounded courteous, but there was something unusual about it. His focus remained on me. Not on Michael, not on Dad, on me. Michael approached carefully. His smile looked forced. "Sir, it's an honor to meet you." The Admiral shook his hand. "Congratulations on your promotion." Michael beamed. For a second, normalcy seemed ready to return. Then the Admiral added something that changed everything again. "I'm sure your sister is proud of you." My brother's smile faded slightly. The Admiral had deliberately redirected attention back to me. Whispers spread across the room. I could almost hear people thinking, "How does he know her?" A new chair arrived. A proper banquet chair. The Admiral personally pulled it out. For me. The room practically stopped breathing. My father looked like he had swallowed a stone. The image alone was shocking. An Admiral standing beside a woman everyone had just mocked, treating her with visible respect, offering her a seat. I sat down. The Admiral took the chair beside me. Not the seat reserved near the stage, not the VIP table. Beside me. Gasps echoed around the room. Dad's face lost color. For the first time all day, he looked uncertain. The Master of Ceremonies hurried over. "Sir, we have a table prepared for you." The Admiral nodded politely. "I'm comfortable here." The room fell silent again, because everyone understood what that meant. The most important guest in attendance had chosen to sit beside the woman next to the trash can. Several military officers entered the hall behind him. Senior officers, decorated officers, men and women with decades of service. As they spotted the Admiral, they approached. Then they noticed me, and their reactions mirrored his. Respect. Recognition. One officer smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, ma'am." Another shook my hand. "It's been too long." A third laughed softly. "I should have known you'd somehow end up stealing the spotlight." The room stared in disbelief. Nobody knew what to say anymore, least of all my father. I could see him replaying the last hour in his head. The joke. The laughter. The chair. The trash can. For the first time, he seemed to realize something was terribly wrong. Not wrong for me. Wrong for him. One of the officers leaned toward another. He thought he was whispering quietly, but in the silence, everyone heard him. "Do they really not know who she is?" The question landed like a grenade. Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Not yet. And judging by the growing panic on my father's face, the truth was about to become very expensive. For the next several minutes, nobody paid attention to the stage. Nobody cared about the decorations. Nobody cared about the catering. Nobody even cared about Michael's promotion ceremony. The entire room was focused on one question. Who was I? I could almost see it spreading from table to table. The same people who had ignored me an hour earlier were now stealing glances in my direction, whispering, speculating, trying to solve a mystery they hadn't known existed. My father stood frozen near the stage. I had never seen him look so uncertain. Richard Carter was a man who always believed he understood a room. He understood people. He understood status. At least he thought he did. But for the first time in his life, he was completely lost. The Admiral sat beside me calmly. He wasn't trying to create a scene. That was the irony. The scene existed because of how everyone else was reacting. He simply treated me the same way he always had, with professional respect. A server approached nervously. "Would you like anything, Admiral?" He glanced toward me. "Has Commander Carter been served?" The young woman blinked. "Commander." The word spread instantly. "Commander." I heard it bounce across the room like a pebble skipping across water. Commander Carter. Not Secretary Carter. Not Administrative Assistant Carter. Commander Carter. The server looked at me. I smiled kindly. I'm fine, thank you. She nodded and hurried away. The whispers intensified. Several guests immediately pulled out their phones. Within minutes, people were searching. Searching my name. Searching military records. Searching professional biographies. Searching anything they could find. My father noticed. What are they doing? Nobody answered him. Michael pulled out his own phone. I watched his expression change. Then change again. Then completely disappear. His eyes moved slowly across the screen. He looked up at me. Then back down. Then up again. As though he couldn't believe what he was reading. I understood why. Because for 20 years I had deliberately kept my career private. Whenever relatives asked questions, I changed the subject. Whenever people praised me, I redirected attention elsewhere. I had learned long ago that talking about accomplishments rarely changes people's opinions, especially when those opinions are already fixed. But now the information was everywhere, and nobody could ignore it anymore. The first officer standing nearby finally spoke. "Ma'am, are you still overseeing Atlantic Emergency Response Operations?" I nodded. "Among other responsibilities." The officer smiled. "Your hurricane evacuation protocols saved lives all over the East Coast." Several people overheard him. More whispers. More confused looks. My father looked increasingly uncomfortable. Hurricane evacuations. Emergency response. He had no idea what any of that meant. Truthfully, neither did most people in the room. But they understood one thing. It sounded important. Very important. Michael slowly approached my table. For the first time all afternoon, he looked genuinely nervous. "Evelyn." I looked up. "Yes," his voice was careful. "How long have you been a commander?" The question revealed everything. My own brother didn't know. I gave him a small smile. "Several years." His eyes widened. "Several years. Not several months, not recently. Years." The realization hit him hard. The information hadn't been hidden. He had simply never cared enough to ask. That hurt him. I could see it. Because deep down Michael wasn't cruel. Weak sometimes. Cowardly sometimes. But not cruel. His greatest flaw was allowing our father's opinions to become his own. The Admiral watched quietly. He wasn't enjoying Michael's discomfort. Neither was I. Contrary to what people think, revenge rarely feels as satisfying as imagined. Mostly it feels sad. Sad because the people disappointing you are often the same people you once loved. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. I was 23 years old, fresh off my first deployment. I had returned home after nearly 10 months overseas. Mom had already passed away by then. Dad picked me up at the airport. The ride home lasted almost 2 hours. During those 2 hours, he asked exactly one question about my deployment. One. The rest of the conversation focused on Michael. Michael's new job. Michael's girlfriend. Michael's plans. Michael's future. I remember staring out the passenger window wondering why I kept expecting things to change. That had been nearly 20 years earlier. And somehow I still hadn't fully learned. Back in the present, another officer approached. Then another. Then another. Each greeting made the atmosphere more uncomfortable. Not because they were praising me, because they clearly knew me, respected me, valued me. One senior officer laughed warmly. "Evelyn, I still tell people about that evacuation operation in North Carolina." Several heads turned. "What evacuation?" The officer smiled. 300 civilians trapped during flood conditions." He shook his head. "Most people would have waited for better weather." I immediately interrupted. It wasn't just me. But he ignored the correction. "You made the call." The room listened. Nobody touched their food anymore. Nobody cared about lunch. My father finally stepped forward. His patience had reached its limit. "What exactly is going on here?" The room became quiet. The Admiral looked at him calmly. "There seems to be some confusion." My father forced a laugh. "I think that's fair to say." The Admiral nodded, then spoke carefully. "Your daughter is one of the most respected officers currently serving in her field." My father laughed again. Only this time it sounded nervous, almost desperate. "Come on." Nobody joined his laughter. Nobody. The silence was brutal. The Admiral didn't smile. Neither did the officers. Because none of them considered the statement extraordinary. To them it was simply true. For the first time all day my father looked genuinely shaken. A few tables away I noticed several guests reading articles on their phones. One woman covered her mouth. Another stared openly at me. A retired Navy veteran stood slowly from his chair. He had been sitting quietly in the back of the room. Now he looked directly at me. Recognition flashed across his face. "I know that name." The room turned toward him. The elderly veteran pointed gently. "You were the officer who coordinated relief operations after Hurricane Florence." I nodded. The veteran's eyes softened. "My granddaughter was evacuated because of those efforts." Silence. Absolute silence. The old man placed a hand over his heart. "Thank you." I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded. But I noticed something happening nearby. My father's shoulders had begun to sag. The confidence that carried him through the afternoon was disappearing, because the story he had told himself for years was collapsing. The disappointing daughter, the successful son, the family hierarchy, all of it. Then, before anyone could speak again, the master of ceremonies rushed back onto the stage. His face looked pale. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and made an announcement nobody expected. "Before we continue with today's promotion ceremony, we have been authorized to conduct a special recognition presentation." Confused murmurs filled the room. Michael frowned. My father blinked. The master of ceremonies looked directly at me, then smiled. "And the individual being recognized today is Commander Evelyn Carter." The room exploded with shock, and the biggest surprise of the day was still yet to come. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The master of ceremonies stood at the podium holding a folder, while more than 100 guests stared at me. Commander Evelyn Carter. The name seemed to hang in the air. My brother looked stunned. My father looked as if the floor had vanished beneath him. And honestly, part of me wished the ceremony would simply end. I never enjoyed being the center of attention. That might sound strange after everything that happened, but it was true. The Navy had taught me many things over the years. One of them was that real leadership rarely seeks applause. The mission comes first. The people come first. Recognition comes last. Unfortunately, life doesn't always cooperate with our preferences. The master of ceremonies adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's event includes an unexpected but very special recognition." The room remained silent. Everyone was listening now. Every single person. I glanced toward the Admiral. He gave me a reassuring nod. Then he quietly whispered, "You've earned this." I smiled politely, but inside I felt something entirely different. Nervous. Not because of the recognition, because of my father. A small part of me still worried about what this would do to him. Even after everything. Even after the trash can. Even after the laughter. Children never completely stop caring what their parents think. The master of ceremonies continued. "Commander Evelyn Carter has spent more than 2 decades serving the United States Navy with distinction." Several large monitors positioned around the room suddenly came to life. A slideshow appeared. The first photograph showed me at 20 years old. Young, thin, standing awkwardly beside a training instructor. A few relatives gasped. Many had never seen the picture. The second photo appeared. Then the third. Then dozens more. Deployments. Command centers. Disaster response operations, humanitarian missions, rescue efforts, military ceremonies, places my family had never asked about, places I had never talked about. The room watched quietly. The master of ceremonies read from the official record. "Commander Carter has led multiple large-scale emergency response operations throughout the Atlantic region." Another image appeared. Floodwaters, rescue helicopters, emergency shelters. The room grew even quieter. "She has coordinated evacuation efforts involving thousands of civilians during hurricanes and natural disasters." My father stared at the screen. His expression changed with every photograph. I could almost see the memories forming inside his head. The birthdays he missed. The phone calls he rushed through. The conversations he never had. Years he never bothered to understand. The presenter continued. "Her leadership during several emergency operations has been recognized at both regional and national levels." The audience applauded softly. I wished they wouldn't. Recognition always feels strange when so many people contributed. No operation is ever accomplished alone. No mission belongs to one person. But there was no stopping the ceremony now. A video began playing. Several military personnel appeared on screen. One by one they spoke. A senior chief described a hurricane evacuation. A Coast Guard officer discussed joint rescue operations. A civilian emergency coordinator talked about disaster relief efforts. None of them spoke about medals. None of them spoke about rank. They talked about people, families, lives saved, communities protected, the things that actually mattered. As the video played, I noticed something happening at my father's table. Nobody was speaking to him anymore. Not because they were angry, because they were processing. Many had laughed earlier. Now they were realizing exactly who they had laughed at. Across the room, Michael sat completely still. His eyes never left the screen. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. A sailor appeared in the video. Young. Probably 22. Maybe 23. He looked directly into the camera. I was a brand new officer when I first worked under Commander Carter. He smiled. I thought leadership meant being the smartest person in the room. Several guests chuckled. The young officer continued. She taught me that leadership means taking responsibility when things go wrong and giving credit away when things go right. I looked down, embarrassed. The room listened carefully. The young man smiled again. Everything I know about taking care of people came from her. The video ended. The applause this time was louder, much louder. I wished my mother could have seen it. Not the recognition, the respect. She would have been proud. The master of ceremonies stepped away from the podium. Then something unexpected happened. 3 senior officers approached the stage. Each carried a folder. One carried a presentation case. The audience immediately sensed this wasn't routine. The first officer began speaking. He described a recent operation, an operation that had never appeared in the news. Most military work doesn't. A dangerous situation, complicated logistics, lives at risk. The details remained limited for security reasons, but the outcome was clear. A serious disaster had been prevented. The officer paused. Commander Carter's leadership was instrumental in the success of that mission. Then another officer spoke. Then another. Each described my work. Not dramatically, not theatrically, professionally, respectfully. The effect was overwhelming. Because these were not compliments from family, not favors, not politics. These were assessments from people who had spent decades judging performance, and they all reached the same conclusion. I had done my job well, very well. When the final speaker finished, the room rose to its feet, a standing ovation. I honestly didn't know where to look. My face felt warm. My hands trembled slightly, not from pride, from emotion. Because for the first time in my life, I was standing in front of my family exactly as I was. Not underestimated, not dismissed, not ignored, simply seen. Then came the biggest misunderstanding of the afternoon. One of the local officials leaned toward another guest. His whisper carried farther than he intended. Well, now we know why the Admiral is here. Several people nodded. They assumed the answer was obvious. I heard another whisper. She's his wife. More nods. The room seemed relieved. The mystery had been solved, or so they thought. The Admiral slowly stood. He approached the podium. The audience immediately quieted. He looked across the room, then directly at my father. My wife is indeed seated in this room today. Several guests smiled knowingly. The Admiral continued. But I would like to correct a misunderstanding. The smiles disappeared. His voice remained calm, measured, professional. I am not here because Commander Carter is married to me. The room froze. You could have heard a pin drop. The Admiral glanced toward me, then back toward the audience. I am here because I have spent years watching one of the finest officers I have ever known serve her country with extraordinary integrity. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The Admiral's next words landed like thunder. I respect her because she earned it. My father's face turned white, completely white. And for the first time all afternoon I saw genuine shame in his eyes. Not embarrassment, not discomfort, shame. Because suddenly he understood something devastating. Everything he admired in Michael, everything he celebrated, everything he valued, his daughter had achieved in abundance. And he had never even bothered to look. A few minutes later, while the applause continued around the room, I noticed movement near the exit. My father was quietly walking away, alone, head lowered. Shoulders slumped. No one stopped him. No one called after him. He disappeared through the doors without saying a word. And for reasons I couldn't fully explain. Watching him leave hurt far more than watching him laugh. The applause continued long after my father left the room. People shook my hand. Military officers offered congratulations. Former colleagues shared stories. Guests who had ignored me all afternoon suddenly wanted to talk. But my attention kept drifting toward the exit, toward the door my father had walked through. The truth was, I hadn't come to the ceremony hoping for revenge. I know that's probably hard to believe, especially after everything that happened. The trash can, the joke, the laughter, the humiliation. But revenge had never been my goal. If it had been, I would have revealed my career years ago. I would have corrected people. I would have demanded recognition. Instead, I spent most of my adult life doing the opposite. Keeping quiet. Moving forward. Building a life without waiting for my family's approval. At least that was what I told myself. Yet as I stood there accepting congratulations, I realized something uncomfortable. Part of me had never stopped hoping. Hoping my father would someday see me. Not Commander Carter. Not the officer. Not the decorated veteran. Just his daughter. The daughter he had overlooked for most of her life. The ceremony ended about an hour later. Guests gradually departed. Tables emptied. The banquet hall grew quieter. The Admiral and I lingered behind, speaking with a few officers. Eventually, Michael approached. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. There were dark circles beneath his eyes that hadn't been there earlier. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. "I'm sorry." Simple words, but sincere. I could hear it. I looked at him carefully. "For what?" He swallowed. "For a lot of things." His eyes dropped toward the floor. "I should have said something when Dad put you beside the trash can." I remained silent. He continued. "I should have said something years ago." That one hurt. Because it was true. Not just today. Years. Decades. Michael rubbed the back of his neck. "I always knew he treated us differently." His voice grew quieter. "I just didn't want to admit it." There it was. The truth. Not cruelty. Cowardice. A different problem. But still a problem. I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying it." He looked relieved. Not forgiven, just relieved. As though carrying that truth had become exhausting. Then he asked a question. One I'd never expected. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I smiled sadly. "Tell you what?" "Any of it," he gestured vaguely. "The Navy, the promotions, the operations, everything." I thought about that. The answer wasn't simple. Finally, I shrugged. Nobody ever asked. Michael looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. Because he knew it was true. Nobody had asked. Not really. Not in a meaningful way. The conversation ended there. Neither of us knew what else to say. Some wounds require more than one afternoon to heal. That evening, I drove alone to a small cemetery outside Richmond. The sun was beginning to set. The air felt cool, peaceful. I parked near the entrance and carried a small bouquet of flowers. My mother's grave sat beneath a large oak tree, the same tree she loved when she was alive. I placed the flowers beside the headstone, then sat quietly. For a long time, I simply stared at her name. The years disappear in places like that. You stop feeling 42. You stop feeling important. You stop feeling successful. You become a child again. A daughter. Someone who misses her mother. "I wish you'd been there today." The words escaped before I realized I had spoken them aloud. A breeze moved through the trees. Leaves rustled softly overhead. I smiled. Mom would have known exactly what to say. She always did. The Admiral arrived a few minutes later. He found me sitting on the grass. Neither of us spoke immediately. After all these years together, silence had become comfortable. Eventually, he sat beside me. "You okay?" I nodded, then shook my head, then laughed softly. "Maybe," he smiled. "That's honest." We sat quietly, watching the sunset, listening to birds settle into the trees. Finally, I told him what I had been thinking. I thought today would feel better. He understood immediately. The ceremony, the reveal. The Admiral nodded. I continued. I thought maybe it would fix something. His expression softened. But it didn't. I looked toward my mother's grave. "No." He waited. Patient as always. Eventually I found the words. I spent years thinking that if my father finally saw what I'd accomplished, everything would make sense. The Admiral sighed gently. "And now," I smiled sadly, "now I know it doesn't work that way." He placed a hand over mine. No accomplishment heals an old wound by itself. That was one of the reasons I loved him. He never offered easy answers. Only honest ones. The next morning my father sat alone in his house. I didn't know it then, but Michael would later tell me what happened. After returning home, Dad couldn't sleep. He wandered through old boxes stored in the attic. Photographs, documents, memories. Eventually he found something he hadn't seen in years. A small cardboard box labeled Evelyn. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Letters I had written throughout my career. Letters I never mailed. Most were written during deployments. Lonely nights. Long missions. Difficult assignments. Not official reports. Personal thoughts. The things a daughter wishes she could tell her father. In one letter I described missing home. In another I talked about wishing Mom were still alive. In another I admitted something I had never said aloud. I wanted Dad to be proud of me. Apparently, he read every single one after another, hour after hour, alone. By sunrise, he was crying. Michael told me later it was the first time he had ever seen our father cry. Not when Mom died. Not during hardships. Not during failures. Never. But that morning he did. Because for the first time he wasn't looking at rank, or achievements, or promotions. He was looking at the lonely little girl hidden behind all of them, and finally seeing her. The next morning shortly after breakfast, there was a knock on my hotel room door. I opened it. My father stood outside. His eyes were red. His shoulders looked older, smaller somehow. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "Evelyn, could we talk?" And for the first time in my life, I heard humility in his voice. For a few seconds, I simply stared at him. The man standing outside my hotel room barely resembled the father I had known most of my life. The Richard Carter I grew up with always seemed larger than life. Confident, opinionated, certain. Certain he was right. Certain he understood people. Certain he knew what mattered. The man standing before me now looked tired. Not physically tired. Soul tired, as though something heavy had finally caught up with him. "Evelyn, could we talk?" His voice was quiet. Careful. Almost fragile. I stepped aside. "Come in." He entered slowly. The room suddenly felt very small. I sat near the window. He chose the chair across from me. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was simply crowded with 40 years of unfinished conversations. Finally, my father took a deep breath. "I don't know where to start." I looked at him. "Then start with the truth." He nodded. A slow, painful nod. Then he surprised me. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame stress. He didn't blame grief. He didn't blame my mother's death. He didn't blame anyone. Instead, he looked directly at me and said, "I failed you." The words hung in the air. Simple. Honest. Devastating. My father swallowed hard. "I failed you as a father." Tears filled his eyes. I've been sitting with that all night. I remained silent. Not because I was angry. Because I needed to hear everything. For once. The whole truth. I spent years convincing myself I was treating you fairly. His voice cracked. But I wasn't. He shook his head. "I favored Michael." Another pause. "I always favored Michael." The honesty hurt. But strangely, it also brought relief. There is something powerful about hearing a truth finally spoken aloud. Especially one you've carried alone for decades. Dad continued. "I don't even know when it started." He stared down at his hands. "Maybe because he reminded me of myself." He laughed bitterly. "Maybe because I understood him better." Another pause. "Maybe because I was blind." I watched him carefully. For the first time in my life, I wasn't seeing my father defend himself. I was watching him confront himself. And those are very different things. His eyes lifted toward mine. "When your mother died, I got worse." I nodded slowly. We both knew it. Neither of us had ever said it, but we both knew. I poured everything into Michael. His voice grew softer. "And I assumed you'd be okay." A tear rolled down his cheek. "I thought you were strong enough not to need me." That one hit hard. Because it explained so much. Not everything, but enough. Many people mistake strength for invulnerability. They see the child who survives, the child who adapts, the child who carries on, and they assume that child doesn't hurt. But strength doesn't eliminate pain. It simply hides it. My father wiped his eyes. Then he said something I never expected. "I read your letters." I froze. The letters. For a moment I couldn't speak. He nodded. "Every one of them." His voice broke completely. "I should have read them years ago." I looked away, suddenly afraid I might cry too. Those letters contained parts of me nobody had ever seen. Fear, loneliness, hope, heartbreak. The things I never said out loud. My father shook his head. "You kept reaching for me." Another tear. "And I wasn't there." The room fell silent again. Outside traffic moved along the street below. Inside time seemed to stop. Eventually I asked the question that mattered most. "Why?" Dad looked confused. "Why what?" "Why was I never enough?" The words escaped before I could stop them. 40 years. One question. His face collapsed. The answer came immediately. "No." He shook his head desperately. "No, Evelyn?" More tears. "You were always enough." I stared at him. He continued. "The problem wasn't you." Another pause. "It was me." The room became very quiet. Because deep down I think both of us had waited decades for those words. The problem wasn't you. Not every wound can be healed. But some wounds finally stopped bleeding. A few minutes later, another knock sounded at the door. "Michael." I opened it. He looked nervous, almost as nervous as Dad. When he entered and saw our father crying, his expression changed immediately. The three of us sat together, awkwardly at first. Then, honestly, for the next hour we talked. Really talked. Maybe for the first time in our lives. Michael admitted things too. He admitted he enjoyed being the favorite. He admitted he stayed silent when he should have spoken. He admitted he sometimes accepted praise that belonged to both of us. None of it was easy. None of it erased the past. But it mattered. Because healing begins where honesty begins. Eventually, Michael looked at me and said, "I don't want to lose my sister." I smiled through tears. "Then don't." That simple. That complicated. By noon, something had changed. Not perfectly. Not magically. But genuinely, the walls we'd spent decades building had begun to crack. A few months later, another family gathering took place. Nothing formal. No ceremonies. No promotions. No speeches. Just a Sunday dinner. The kind families have every day across America. When I arrived, my father met me at the door. He hugged me, then led me inside. There beside his chair was a place setting. My place setting. He smiled. "Saved you a seat." Such a small gesture. Most people would never notice. But I did. Because all those years ago I had wanted a seat at the table. Not because of status, not because of recognition. Because I wanted to belong. And finally I did. Not because I became successful. Not because I earned medals. Not because an admiral defended me. But because the truth finally entered the room. And once the truth arrives, healing becomes possible. Looking back now, the greatest victory wasn't watching my father feel embarrassed. It wasn't seeing guests shocked. It wasn't hearing applause. The greatest victory was discovering that revenge doesn't always mean destroying someone. Sometimes it means allowing them to see what they've done, and giving them the chance to become better. My father can never give me back the years we lost. Neither of us can change the past. But we can choose what happens next. And sometimes that's enough. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this. Never assume you know someone's worth based on where they're sitting. You never know what battles they've fought. You never know what sacrifices they've made. And you never know how deeply a kind word